There are weapons designed to win wars, weapons designed to deter wars, and weapons designed to convince your adversary that war itself has become unwinnable. What we are looking at tonight belongs to that third category. And if you think the discussion surrounding Russia's Poseidon system is merely another exaggerated Cold War headline recycled for clicks and panic, then you fundamentally misunderstand the direction modern strategic warfare is moving. Because this is not simply about a torpedo. It is not even simply about nuclear weapons. What we are talking about now is the weaponization of geography itself, the deliberate transformation of the ocean into a strategic delivery system capable of inflicting catastrophic damage against an entire coastline without requiring traditional invasion, traditional occupation, or even traditional nuclear strike doctrine. And if you stay with me until the end of this analysis, I'm going to explain why systems like Poseidon represent something much larger than a new Russian weapons platform. They represent the collapse of assumptions that have governed American maritime security since the end of the Second World War. Now let me say something immediately with complete clarity before we go any further. The United States has spent decades building military doctrine around one central strategic belief, that distance protects the American homeland. The Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, carrier strike groups, forward bases, early warning systems, anti-submarine warfare networks. All of it was built around the assumption that any existential threat could be detected, intercepted, or deterred long before it reached the continental United States. Poseidon challenges that assumption directly. And that is why military planners take this system seriously, even when public discussions often drift toward sensationalism. Now understand something important here. The Russians did not develop Poseidon because they believed conventional naval competition favored them long term. They developed it because they concluded that matching the United States symmetrically, carrier for carrier, fleet for fleet, global base for global base, was economically unsustainable. Russia looked at American maritime dominance and chose asymmetry instead. That is classic Russian strategic thinking. When direct parity becomes impossible, create a system your adversary cannot cheaply defend against. And that is exactly what Poseidon attempts to do. Now stay with me because this next point is absolutely critical if you want to understand the deeper strategic logic behind weapons like this. Nuclear deterrence historically revolved around cities, missile silos, command centers, industrial zones, and military infrastructure. But over time, missile defenses improved. Early warning systems improved. Submarine tracking improved. Space-based surveillance improved. So strategic planners began asking a dangerous question. What if instead of targeting hardened military systems directly, you targeted the environmental and geographic foundations supporting civilization itself? That is where Poseidon enters the picture. Now let me explain why underwater nuclear systems create such unusual strategic complications. Water behaves very differently from air during high-energy detonations. Pressure transmission, shock wave propagation, acoustic energy movement. All of it functions through different physical dynamics than atmospheric blast effects. Under certain conditions, underwater detonations can transfer energy across enormous distances through oceanic mediums with terrifying efficiency. That's not science fiction. That's physics. And if you think that's alarming, the next reality is even more serious. Modern coastal civilization is extraordinarily vulnerable. Ports, naval bases, financial centers, shipping hubs, energy terminals, population density corridors, telecommunications infrastructure, industrial logistics. The majority of advanced economies concentrate critical systems near coastlines, especially the United States. Now ask yourself one question. What happens strategically if adversaries begin developing systems specifically optimized to exploit that geographic concentration? That is the strategic logic behind Poseidon, not tactical naval warfare, strategic coercion. Now let me explain why this matters so much psychologically as well. Deterrence is never purely about destruction. It is about perception, fear, uncertainty, strategic doubt. The mere possibility that an autonomous underwater nuclear system could bypass existing missile defense architectures and threaten catastrophic coastal damage forces military planners into extremely uncomfortable calculations. Because how do you defend every mile of coastline against deep-water autonomous systems operating below traditional anti-submarine engagement envelopes? That's the problem. Now understand something important here. American anti-submarine warfare capability remains among the most sophisticated military systems ever developed. The United States invested decades into acoustic detection networks, attack submarines, maritime patrol aviation, underwater surveillance arrays, and integrated naval intelligence systems specifically to track Soviet and later Russian submarines. But Poseidon was never designed to behave like a traditional submarine. That distinction matters enormously. Traditional submarines prioritize stealth combined with survivable crew operations. Poseidon prioritizes autonomous survivability and depth. It removes many of the constraints human crews impose on underwater systems. Life support, habitability, crew endurance, emergency recovery considerations. All of that disappears. And once those constraints disappear, entirely different operational profiles become possible. Deeper operation, longer endurance, different propulsion logic, different acoustic characteristics, different risk calculations. That changes anti-submarine warfare mathematics substantially. Now stay with me because this next point explains why naval strategists increasingly worry about autonomous underwater warfare generally, not just Poseidon specifically. The future maritime battlefield may not revolve solely around aircraft carriers and crewed submarines anymore. Autonomous systems are rapidly transforming naval doctrine globally. Unmanned underwater vehicles, autonomous surveillance networks, AI-assisted target identification, long-endurance drone submarines. The oceans themselves are becoming algorithmic battle spaces. And this is where the situation becomes extremely dangerous, because underwater warfare already suffers from one of the greatest instability problems in military strategy: uncertainty. You often cannot see the threat directly. You cannot always confirm location. You cannot guarantee tracking continuity. You cannot easily distinguish surveillance from attack preparation. And uncertainty under nuclear conditions becomes extraordinarily dangerous. Now, if you think that sounds theoretical, history again tells us otherwise. During the Cold War, American and Soviet submarines repeatedly played cat-and-mouse games beneath the Atlantic under conditions of limited visibility and enormous strategic tension. Accidents occurred, collisions occurred, near misses occurred, false assumptions occurred. And those were human-crewed systems operating under comparatively slower technological conditions. Today, the pace is accelerating dramatically. Now, let me explain why autonomous nuclear systems create a uniquely dangerous escalation problem. Traditional nuclear deterrence still relied heavily on human judgment. Missile crews received orders, submarine commanders interpreted doctrine, political leadership retained escalation authority. But autonomous systems introduce new ambiguity regarding decision timelines, communication continuity, and operational independence, especially if communication links become disrupted during conflict conditions. That is the nightmare scenario military planners increasingly discuss privately, not runaway robots from movies, but strategic systems operating semi-independently inside environments where communications, satellites, and command structures may already be degraded by cyber warfare, electronic warfare, or kinetic strikes. Now think carefully about how dangerous that becomes during a future major power confrontation. Cyber attacks targeting naval networks, satellite disruption affecting navigation systems, anti-submarine warfare operations occurring simultaneously with long-range missile exchanges. electronic warfare degrading communications reliability. All of that creates confusion, and confusion is extraordinarily dangerous under nuclear conditions. Now, let me explain why Russia views systems like Poseidon as strategically valuable beyond their actual wartime use. In many ways, the weapon's greatest utility may exist before detonation ever occurs. The uncertainty itself becomes coercive. The possibility that autonomous systems could remain undetected beneath the Atlantic introduces enormous pressure on political decision-making during crises. That pressure shapes behavior. That is deterrence. Now stay with me because this next part explains why the broader geopolitical environment matters so much here. Russia increasingly believes the United States and NATO are pursuing long-term strategic containment against Moscow itself. Sanctions, military expansion, missile defense architecture, intelligence operations, proxy conflicts, technological isolation. Russian leadership increasingly interprets all of this through an existential lens. That changes strategic planning dramatically. Because countries believing they face long-term strategic encirclement begin prioritizing survivable asymmetric systems over traditional power projection. Poseidon fits perfectly inside that logic. Now, if you think that's alarming, the next reality is even worse. China is watching all of this extremely carefully. Beijing understands that maritime vulnerability sits at the center of modern great power competition. Trade routes, naval choke points, carrier operations, undersea infrastructure, Pacific logistics chains. The future of global power increasingly depends on undersea dominance. That means autonomous underwater warfare technologies will almost certainly proliferate over time, not remain uniquely Russian forever. And once multiple nuclear powers possess autonomous deep-water strategic systems, the oceans become much more unstable politically. Now let me tell you what concerns serious military strategists most about where this trend is heading. Historically, geography stabilized American security enormously. Oceans created warning time. Warning time created decision space. Decision space created stability. Autonomous undersea systems compress that stability because detection becomes uncertain, tracking becomes uncertain, interception becomes uncertain, and uncertainty during crisis conditions increases escalation pressure dramatically. Now think carefully about what this means for future naval doctrine. The United States may eventually face pressure to militarize coastlines more heavily, expand underwater surveillance infrastructure massively, deploy autonomous countersystems, increase undersea sensor density, and integrate AI-assisted maritime detection systems across enormous geographic areas. That becomes extraordinarily expensive, and strategic competition increasingly revolves around forcing adversaries into unsustainable defense burdens. Russia understands this perfectly. Poseidon may never need to detonate to alter American strategic calculations significantly. Now let me explain why the psychological dimension matters just as much as the physical one. The image of an unstoppable underwater nuclear system approaching the coastline creates a very specific kind of fear: helplessness. Traditional deterrence still allows populations to imagine missile interception, retaliation, escalation control, diplomacy. But systems perceived as invisible, autonomous, and difficult to intercept undermine psychological confidence in national defense itself. That affects political systems profoundly, especially democratic societies. And this is where things become historically significant. We are entering an era where technological asymmetry increasingly matters more than numerical superiority. Small numbers of highly specialized systems may create disproportionate strategic leverage if they exploit vulnerabilities existing outside traditional defense architectures. Poseidon represents that kind of thinking, not mass warfare, strategic disruption. Now ask yourself one final question before we continue. What happens if future nuclear deterrence no longer revolves primarily around protecting cities from missiles, but around protecting entire coastlines, infrastructure ecosystems, and economic geography from autonomous systems operating below the surface, where traditional military dominance becomes far less decisive. Because that may be the real strategic transformation beginning now beneath the Atlantic itself. Now, here is where the situation becomes even more dangerous, because the real strategic significance of systems like Poseidon is not simply the destruction they could theoretically cause. It is the fact that they fundamentally challenge the assumptions modern military powers built their security architecture around for nearly 80 years. The United States designed its post-Second World War military structure around layered defense, forward deployment, and strategic depth. Carrier groups pushed threats away from American shores. Overseas bases extended warning time. Submarine fleets controlled the oceans. Missile defense systems focused primarily on aerial trajectories. But Poseidon bypasses much of that logic entirely. And that is why serious naval strategists are paying such close attention to the future of autonomous underwater warfare right now. Because once a strategic weapon enters the oceanic environment, operating independently at extreme depth, the traditional detection-interception timeline becomes dramatically more uncertain. That is the key issue, not sensational headlines, strategic uncertainty. Now let me explain why this matters so much operationally. Anti-submarine warfare is already one of the most technically demanding military disciplines on Earth. Detecting conventional submarines requires enormous coordination between sonar networks, maritime patrol aircraft, attack submarines, underwater listening arrays, satellites, and naval intelligence systems. The ocean itself is incredibly complex acoustically. Temperature layers distort sound. Pressure changes alter detection profiles. Natural ocean noise creates interference continuously. And that is before autonomous systems enter the equation. Now imagine a platform designed specifically to exploit those conditions while operating without many of the limitations imposed by human crews. Extreme depth operation, long duration endurance, different propulsion signatures, reduced communication dependency, non-traditional movement profiles. Suddenly, the detection challenge changes substantially. That is why Poseidon represents more than just another torpedo. It represents a shift in strategic philosophy. Now stay with me because this next point explains why future great power competition may increasingly move underwater. For decades, military attention focused heavily on air superiority, missile defense, cyber warfare, and space systems. But beneath all of that, the oceans quietly became the infrastructure foundation of globalization itself. Undersea internet cables, energy pipelines, maritime trade routes, naval logistics corridors, strategic submarine patrol zones. Modern civilization depends heavily on underwater infrastructure, and underwater infrastructure is extraordinarily difficult to defend comprehensively. That vulnerability changes strategic calculations dramatically. Now, if you think that's alarming, the next reality is even more significant. Autonomous underwater systems are not limited to nuclear missions. The technologies driving Poseidon, long-endurance operation, autonomous navigation, deep-water survivability, AI-assisted routing, can eventually influence surveillance systems, infrastructure sabotage platforms, underwater drones, naval mining systems, and anti-shipping operations globally. In other words, Poseidon may be less important as a single weapon and more important as proof of concept for a much broader transformation in maritime warfare. That is what military planners are really watching. Now think carefully about what this means psychologically for American strategic doctrine. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States largely operated from a position of maritime confidence. Carrier strike groups projected overwhelming power globally. American submarines dominated underwater stealth warfare. The homeland itself remained geographically insulated from most conventional threats. But systems like Poseidon erode that psychological insulation, because they introduce the possibility that the ocean itself may no longer guarantee strategic safety. And once strategic safety disappears psychologically, political behavior changes. Now, let me explain why this trend matters globally beyond Russia and the United States. China is investing heavily in undersea technologies because Beijing understands the Pacific theater is fundamentally maritime. The Taiwan question is maritime. Indo-Pacific logistics are maritime. American alliance structures across the Pacific depend heavily on naval mobility and undersea infrastructure. China studies every Russian innovation carefully, not necessarily to copy it directly, but to understand how asymmetry can challenge superior conventional naval power. And this is where the future becomes extraordinarily unstable. Once multiple great powers begin integrating autonomous underwater systems into deterrence doctrine simultaneously, underwater environments become saturated with strategic ambiguity. Was that detected object a surveillance drone, an attack platform, an infrastructure mapping system, an autonomous nuclear deterrent? Uncertainty multiplies rapidly, and uncertainty under crisis conditions becomes one of the greatest escalation risks in military history. Now, stay with me because this next part explains why artificial intelligence complicates all of this even further. Autonomous systems increasingly rely on machine learning for navigation, pattern recognition, route optimization, obstacle avoidance, and adaptive operation. That means future underwater warfare may evolve at machine speed in environments where human situational awareness remains limited. That is a dangerous combination, because oceans already obscure information naturally. Adding AI-driven autonomous operation on top of that creates environments where military systems may interact faster than political leadership can interpret events accurately. Now ask yourself one question. What happens during a future crisis if autonomous systems from multiple nuclear powers begin operating near each other underwater, while cyber warfare, satellite disruption, and electronic interference are occurring simultaneously above the surface? That is the nightmare scenario serious strategists increasingly discuss privately, not because anyone wants war, but because technological complexity itself creates instability. Now let me explain why logistics and economics matter enormously here too. One of the oldest principles in military competition is forcing adversaries into disproportionate defense spending. If relatively limited numbers of autonomous underwater systems can compel the United States to expand underwater surveillance across thousands of miles of coastline, reinforce naval infrastructure, deploy additional submarines, harden ports, and expand AI-driven detection systems, the defense burden itself becomes strategically valuable. That is classic asymmetric competition. Create uncertainty cheaply. Force your adversary to spend massively defending against it. Russia has used this logic repeatedly throughout its military history. Now, if you think that's alarming, the next reality is even worse. The oceans themselves are becoming crowded strategically. Commercial shipping, energy infrastructure, military patrols, autonomous drones, submarine fleets, data cables, surveillance systems, fisheries disputes, Arctic competition, resource exploration. All of these pressures are increasing simultaneously. That means future underwater incidents may become much more common. And incidents involving autonomous systems are uniquely dangerous because attribution and intent become harder to determine quickly. Was it malfunction, reconnaissance, deliberate provocation, attack preparation? The ambiguity itself becomes destabilizing. Now think carefully about how dramatically warfare has changed over the last several decades. During the 20th century, military dominance depended heavily on mass industrial production and territorial control. But 21st century competition increasingly revolves around exploiting vulnerabilities within interconnected systems. Cyber vulnerabilities, infrastructure vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities, information vulnerabilities, maritime vulnerabilities. Poseidon reflects exactly that shift. Not conventional conquest, strategic disruption. Now, let me tell you what concerns many naval strategists most about the long-term implications here. We may be entering an era where deterrence itself becomes harder to stabilize because autonomous systems reduce transparency. During the Cold War, despite enormous tensions, both sides generally understood each other's nuclear structures reasonably well. Missile silos were visible. Submarine patrol doctrines became partially understood. Launch detection systems provided warning. Autonomous underwater systems reduced that clarity. And reduced clarity increases fear. Fear increases escalation pressure. That is the danger. Now stay with me because this next point explains why Arctic competition is becoming so strategically important as well. Melting Arctic routes, expanding submarine access corridors, undersea resource competition, and northern maritime positioning are transforming the Arctic into a major future strategic theater. Russia understands this very clearly. So does China. So does the Pentagon. Autonomous deepwater systems become especially valuable in environments where traditional surveillance coverage remains difficult and geographic conditions complicate interception. That means the Arctic may eventually become one of the central operational zones of future undersea strategic competition. Now, if you think this sounds like distant science fiction, consider how quickly military technology evolves once strategic value becomes clear. Drone warfare transformed battlefields within a decade. Cyber warfare became central to state competition rapidly. AI-assisted targeting systems are already emerging. Autonomous maritime systems will likely follow the same trajectory. And once proliferation accelerates, strategic stability becomes much harder to maintain. Now let me explain why the psychological component may ultimately matter as much as the military component itself. Great powers rely heavily on public confidence in national defense systems. Populations need to believe governments can protect critical infrastructure, maintain deterrence credibility, and preserve strategic stability. Weapons perceived as unstoppable undermine that confidence enormously, especially systems associated with invisibility, autonomy, and catastrophic environmental effects. That psychological pressure shapes political behavior long before any weapon is ever used. Now think carefully about the broader lesson here. Russia developed Poseidon not because it could outbuild the United States conventionally, but because it sought leverage through asymmetry. That is increasingly how modern military competition works. Find vulnerabilities outside traditional dominance structures. Exploit technological gaps. Force expensive defensive adaptation. China is learning this. Iran studies it. North Korea studies it. Everyone studies asymmetric leverage now. And that means future conflicts may become less predictable than anything military planners managed during the Cold War. Now let me tell you what may matter most about all of this in the end. The real danger is not necessarily one specific Russian system approaching the American coastline tonight. The real danger is that the global strategic environment is entering a phase where automation, autonomy, AI integration, cyber warfare, underwater competition, and nuclear deterrence are all converging simultaneously. That convergence creates enormous instability because political systems evolve slowly, technology evolves rapidly, and military doctrine often adapts somewhere in between under pressure. That is where dangerous miscalculations occur. Now ask yourself one final question. If future nuclear deterrence increasingly depends on autonomous underwater systems operating in opaque environments beneath the oceans, while artificial intelligence accelerates decision cycles and geopolitical tensions continue rising globally, are we moving toward a world where strategic stability becomes harder to maintain than at any point since nuclear weapons first appeared? Because from where I sit, after decades studying military history and strategic competition, that may be the real warning hidden underneath all the headlines about Poseidon and the future of underwater warfare.